July 27, 1943, eastern Ukraine, 14 kilometers west of Belgorod. 41st-degree ground temperature. The T-34s were cooking from the inside out. By midday, the sun had turned the Donets Basin into a crucible of dust and steel. The Luftwaffe hadn't attacked that morning, but their absence only made the heat more unbearable. In the scrubland near the Sel River, the 129th Soviet Tank Battalion was stalled under open sky, engines idling at minimal RPMs, radios hissing static. Orders had been clear: hold position, conserve fuel, wait for the second armored wave before pushing toward Prokhorovka. But that plan had never accounted for temperatures like this. Inside turret number 6, the oil gauge blinked red for the second time in an hour. Sergeant Anatoly Vorobyov, 24 years old, tank commander and former farmhand from Kursk, banged the side of the gauge with a grease-covered fist. No use. The radiator was boiling. Again. Across the column, similar signs began appearing. Coolant overflow, warped exhaust notes, rattling fans, a pungent mix of glycol and burning rubber. In Tank 03B, the loader passed out from heat stroke, crumpling onto the floor plates without a sound. No one could tell if the sweat on their faces was water or vaporized coolant. They had fought Panthers. They had survived Stukas. But now, they were being beaten by their own machines. All 23 tanks had been upgraded in June, with the new Mk7 dual-circuit cooling unit, rushed into service from the Kharkov locomotive factory. The theory behind the system was sound: 2 independent coolant loops, one for the engine block and one for the transmission housing, designed to mitigate battlefield failures and prevent cascade breakdowns. But theory didn't survive long in the South Ukrainian steppe, where summer heat could liquefy grease and where the slightest incline forced engines to run 30% hotter. Most of the tankers didn't know how the Mk7 worked. They knew only that when it failed like a noose, except one man. He wasn't a tanker, he wasn't even a soldier. His name was Iosif Gurevich, age 39, civilian engineer, conscripted as a logistics technician in May 1943 and attached to the 129th Battalion for on-site technical assessment of field cooling units. He wasn't supposed to fight. He wasn't even supposed to touch the tanks unless ordered. But on that day, when every gauge crept past critical, when coolant hissed through gaskets like dying breath, when the T-34s turned into steel coffins, he disobeyed. Hand changed the entire course of the battalion's advance. Gurevich wasn't a hero, not in the traditional sense. He never fired a round, never stormed a trench. But in 1942, he had designed a prototype cooling unit for diesel locomotives operating in extreme thermal loads. His design was ridiculed, overbuilt, too experimental, not compatible with Red Army repair protocols. Still, he persisted, refining the design in secret, filing over a dozen modification requests. Only after the Stalingrad campaign, when tank attrition was traced partly to internal thermal collapse, did Moscow's Directorate of Armored Innovation, NIBT, take a second look. By then, it was too late for full production. Instead, they approved 100 test units, half of which were fitted into T-34s under rushed conditions. One batch was sent to the 129th, and Gurevich, by a bureaucratic miracle, was sent with them. He arrived in June. The battalion was already preparing for Operation Rumyantsev, a final push to dislodge the Wehrmacht from Belgorod and drive south toward Kharkov. Tankers saw him as a burden, a civilian parasite. He carried no rifle, wore no rank insignia, and slept inside a parts crate. But he watched. Every day. He mapped how each crew handled idling cycles. He memorized fan belt wear by sound. He carried a notepad filled with graphite smudges and annotations, not of tactics, but of fluid dynamics and heat transfer coefficients. No one cared. Until July 27th. At 13:15, the battalion's lead tank, callsign Grom, suffered a thermal rupture. The radiator cracked from pressure, coolant spraying the radio operator in the back. No enemy contact, no mines, just internal death. 15 minutes later, 3 more tanks reported fluid loss. The battalion's commander, Major Levchenko, faced a nightmare. They were less than 12 hours from the scheduled advance. No backup, no shade, no spare radiators. His tanks were dying where they sat, and Gurevich, standing beside a rusted supply truck with a clipboard and sweat-streaked shirt, raised his hand and said, "I can fix them." Levchenko stared. "You're a civilian." "I wrote the blueprint." Levchenko looked at his aide. "No orders covered this." "Then you've got 1 hour." What Gurevich did next was never officially recorded in Soviet archives, but his modifications were later found replicated across 3 battalions before war's end. First, he ordered all tanks shut down and vented, not just idle, but full system depressurization, using a field tool he designed himself, a pressure release rig made from repurposed shell casings and medical tubing. He knew the failure wasn't just heat, it was feedback pressure. The secondary loop was trapping vapor, cycling heat back into the engine jacket like a boiler. He crawled under each T-34, personally bleeding the secondary lines and replacing the coolant cap with a vented coupling fashioned from a crushed rifle barrel sleeve and 2 copper clamps. Then he rebalanced the fan torque settings. The Mk7's flaw, he knew, wasn't in cooling capacity, it was in timing synchronization. The fans pulled air, but at speeds that outpaced coolant flow. That created pockets, dead zones, where vapor formed and pulsed back into the pipes. To solve this, he cross-wired the thermal regulator with the auxiliary light relay, an idea that bordered on madness, so that every time the driver switched to low beam mode, it would pulse the fans in reverse for 3 seconds, purging vapor before it could build. No manual covered this. No mechanic dared touch the wiring harness. But Gurevich wasn't guessing. He was solving a problem he had predicted in 1942 when no one listened. By 1450, 18 tanks had been modified. By 1515, the coolant temps began to stabilize. By 16 nouns, the first engines restarted and held. At WWII Khan the next morning, the 129th Battalion pushed forward, punching through the German picket line 6 kilometers south of Oboyan. Not a single engine failed. The assault was textbook, at least on paper. The 129th Tank Battalion rolled through the German positions with brutal efficiency, scattering infantry and bypassing hastily laid anti-tank traps. The terrain was uneven, cratered with old artillery scars, but the T-34s held formation. More importantly, they held temperature. Major Levchenko, watching from the command half-track, couldn't believe it. Less than 12 hours earlier, he had contemplated abandoning 6 tanks to avoid engine loss. Now the entire column was moving, synced, smooth and cool enough to stay in 3rd gear without redlining. What changed wasn't armor or fuel, it was what Gurevich had done beneath the hulls. By 0840, they had secured the railway embankment northeast of Prokhorovka. 3 German half-tracks were captured, their engines still running. Not a shot had been fired in return. The Wehrmacht units had pulled back, not expecting a full battalion to advance under such heat. They assumed the Soviets would stall again, the way they had in June. They assumed wrong. After the battle, the tankers still didn't know what to make of the wiry, oil-covered man with the stained clipboard who had climbed beneath their machines like some kind of insect. Some called him the Professor. Others just ignored him, eager for rest and a hot ration. Gurevich didn't care. He wasn't looking for respect. He was looking for patterns. Every hour that night, he rechecked the coolant levels in 14 tanks. At one point, a junior mechanic approached, squinting through the beam of a red-lensed flashlight. "Sir, why are you opening the fill ports again? They're holding fine." Gurevich didn't look up. "I'm listening to the vapor pockets." The mechanic stared. Vapor pockets. Gurevich tapped the side of the coolant pipe and tilted his ear. "You can hear them migrate if you know what to listen for. They sound like children tapping glass from the inside." That was Yosif Gurevich in essence. Not a soldier, not even a revolutionary, just a man who heard the machines before they failed. What he was doing wasn't heroism, it was preventative resurrection. Back in Moscow, the Directorate of Armored Innovation, NIBT, had already labeled the Mk7 system a provisional success. A report issued in early July claimed that overall thermal performance has improved field survivability. What they didn't know was that the system's failures were being covered, in the literal sense, by field improvisation and silence. Tank crews rarely submitted breakdowns unless forced. Repairs were made unofficially with scrap. The failures were internal, silent, and thus invisible to command. Gurevich understood this better than anyone. He had seen it happen in the locomotive division a decade earlier, machines praised on paper, dying in the field. But unlike most engineers, he'd gone into the field to see the deaths. That was his edge, that was his crime. Word of his modifications spread, slowly, not officially, but among mechanics. One, a sergeant named Vasilyenko, serving in the 5th Guards Tank Army, had previously served with Gurevich in a locomotive depot before the war. When he heard of a Jew from Kharkov patching Mk7s with rifle parts, he knew who it had to be. Within a week, he submitted a request to visit the 129th, under the pretense of thermal harmonics research. He arrived with a 4-man field crew and a disassembled fan assembly. When they met, neither smiled, just a nod. Then Gurevich pointed at a schematic, and the work began. They modified 11 more tanks over the next 3 days. Then word reached higher, not a commendation, but a summons. August 3rd, 1943, 4th Ukrainian Front Field Headquarters, Kirovograd. Gurevich stood at attention before a folding desk inside a canvas tent, his hands still covered in oil. Across from him sat Colonel Yegor Matlin of the Rear Logistics and Mechanization Division, NIBT liaison officer. "You've been tampering with state-assigned systems without authorization," Matlin said. Gurevich nodded once. "And you are aware this is a violation of Operations Protocol 18D, subsection—" "I saved 23 tanks," Gurevich interrupted. Matlin paused. The room grew quiet. "Explain how." Gurevich didn't appeal to ideology or glory. He gave numbers, flow rates, pressure deltas, thermal lag cycles. He showed how the Mk7 was sabotaging itself under prolonged field idle, and how a 15-ruble modification prevented cascade failure. "I didn't improve the system," he said. "I removed the lie inside it." That last sentence nearly got him arrested. But Matlin wasn't a fool. He had seen the reports. He knew the Mk7 was under scrutiny. He let Gurevich go. Under one condition. "If you're going to keep breaking doctrine, you're going to do it with a pen. You'll file a report, full technical breakdown, and submit it for review. Understood?" Gurevich agreed. He returned to the 129th, where 3 more tanks had reported cooling inconsistencies. He fixed them that same night. The report was filed the next morning. It would sit in a supply office bin for 8 months before being noticed again. But by then, Gurevich's solution had already spread beyond control. Tank crews who heard of the rifle barrel fix began improvising it themselves. They carried copper fittings scrounged from ruined radios. Some even rewired their fan pulse systems, using radio Morse toggles mimicking the auxiliary light method. In the cold bureaucratic light of Moscow, the Mk7 was still under evaluation. In the fields of Ukraine, it had already evolved. By late August 1943, the Battle of Kursk had ended, and the Red Army was pushing the German line back through the fields of Kharkov and into the heavily fortified Dnieper Bend. Tank warfare dominated the southern front. Dozens of battalions advanced daily across farmland and industrial rubble, and every one of them carried the same silent threat within their own hulls. Heat. It wasn't fire that scared the crews. It was pressure. Engineers had learned to fear the slow hidden boil that destroyed a T-34 from the inside. A crack in the radiator seam, a warped gasket, a coolant vapor pocket forming at 120 degrees C that, under the wrong slope, could burst into a scalding jet across a gunner's knees or seize the turret rotation motor entirely. And every time it happened, some mechanic muttered the same phrase, "We should have done the Gurevich fix." It became a refrain, unofficial, borderline subversive. But it spread like truth. In September, the 2nd Tank Corps suffered a series of failures during a river crossing operation south of Kremenchuk. The Mk7 units seized in mid-fording. 11 tanks had to be towed out. 5 were abandoned in the river. The after-action report was scathing. Evidence of overheating despite moderate external conditions. Internal review recommends field engineering solution similar to improvised method observed in the 129th Battalion. Suddenly, Moscow began paying attention. By mid-October, The NIBT Directorate issued Supplementary Instruction 144-S, authorizing field mechanics to modify Mk7 cooling units under extreme operating conditions using approved field expedients. Though no name was mentioned, the engineering diagram attached to the directive, Field Cooling Unit Auxiliary Vent Assembly, was a near-exact copy of Gurevich's rifle barrel vent. Even the misaligned threading was identical. Gurevich didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He continued working, now formally listed as a mobile engineering inspector under 4th Ukrainian Front. His uniform bore a patch, but no rank. His weapon remained a socket wrench. He began carrying a small satchel with 3 spare vent assemblies, pre-formed, each etched with his initials not for pride but for accountability. If it fails, he said once to a junior crewman, they should know who made it fail. He lived in the belly of the machine. In November, during the approach to Kryvyi Rog, the 129th was assigned to a spearhead maneuver through a series of dry gullies. The advance was fast, coordinated, and exposed, no cover, and 11 kilometers between fuel points. Heat was guaranteed. Breakdown was probable. Out of 19 tanks that made the initial push, 17 were Gurevich modified. All 17 reached the staging point with operational cooling systems. 2 that hadn't been touched, due to lack of time, failed halfway. It was no longer a debate. The fix worked, and it saved lives. Still, official recognition eluded him. A mechanic from the 23rd Battalion filed a commendation on Gurevich's behalf, citing engineering excellence in extreme field conditions. It was buried. When a junior commissar asked Gurevich why he hadn't submitted for citation, he replied, "There are men pulling triggers. Mine is a different war." The commissar shook his head. "You'll be forgotten." Gurevich looked down at his hands, cracked, blackened, the nails always stained with grease. "Then let them forget me," he said. "Just don't forget the fix." In late December, with the first frosts forming, a new threat emerged: thermal shock. Tanks starting from cold experienced inverse pressure spikes, coolant froze in places, then flash-boiled in others. The Mk7, already a temperamental system, now faced violent contraction of its pressure lines. Again, crews turned to Gurevich's field notes. The rifle barrel vent design now served a second purpose: equalization of cold start pressure differentials. Mechanics began preheating only the engine jackets, leaving the secondary loop to ambient rise. The vent allowed expansion without rupture. No one had intended the system for this. But it worked, and Gurevich added it to the notes. By January 1944, the field fix had mutated beyond even his original concept. Some battalions had localized versions, adapted with regional materials, bent pipe fittings, valve springs from artillery recoil mechanisms, bicycle parts. He began collecting photos, sketches, building a catalogue he called Improvised Field Vents by Oblast. He laughed once as he showed them to a fellow engineer. "This one here? Belarus used a gramophone crank, still held pressure, still saved a tank." They weren't modifications anymore. They were survival mutations, passed like DNA from crew to crew. And they all traced back to that one afternoon in the sun-blasted fields outside Belgorod. The spring thaw of 1944 was late and violent. Snow melted into thick, viscous mud, and tanks often had to be winched forward in pairs, their tracks churning slush into steam. The 129th Battalion, now seasoned, understrength, and held together more by engineering ingenuity than spare parts, had been reassigned to the 1st Ukrainian Front, operating along the lower Bug River. The T-34s were no longer pristine. Their armor was chipped, their road wheels groaned with age, and many bore field welds that looked more like battlefield scars than maintenance work. But despite the wear, not a single engine failure due to overheating was recorded between March and May. This wasn't because the machines had improved. It was because Iosif Gurevich's design had evolved faster than doctrine. By mid-April, even Moscow could no longer ignore the unauthorized modifications sweeping the southern front. A field inspection report submitted to Stavka, the Soviet High Command, listed 47 tanks across 4 divisions using non-standard secondary pressure vents in their Mk7 units. A quiet inquiry was launched. Then came a visit. April 22, 1944, Forward Motor Pool Depot, Kirovohrad region. A convoy of 3 staff cars arrived under heavy mudguard. Out stepped Major Nikolai Berzin, a deputy director from the NIBT and a man known more for paperwork than engines. He asked no questions at first. He just walked the line of machines, bent down, studied the vent assemblies. Each one was different. Each one held. He asked to see the man responsible. Gurevich, smelling of kerosene and holding a cracked manifold in one hand, was brought forward. His uniform was stained, his badge unreadable. Berzin asked, "Are these your designs?" Gurevich simply nodded. Berzin said nothing for several seconds, then, "You're not an officer. You have no factory clearance, and you rewired systems under combat conditions." Gurevich said nothing. Berzin looked back at the tanks. "They're all working." "Yes," Gurevich said, "because no one told me how not to make them work." Berzin almost smiled. Almost. 3 weeks later, Gurevich was summoned not to prison, but to a meeting in a logistics hut east of Uman. There, he found a revised copy of Field Manual 382D, newly printed, still smelling of ink. Inside, a new schematic appeared. Cooling System Emergency Ventilation Assembly, Pattern B. The drawing was his. Cleaned up, redrawn, with precise measurements. At the bottom, typed in small font, Field-tested modification first observed in units of the 129th Battalion. Design under continuing review, no credit, no name. But it was there, the design had been absorbed, it was now official. Gurevich didn't ask for more, he didn't need a medal. His reward was quieter, because after that day no tank in his battalion ever boiled over again. By the summer of 1944, as Soviet forces crossed into Polish territory and the Vistula loomed on the horizon, Gurevich's fix, or some variation of it, was present in more than 600 tanks. Some were still crafted from scrounged parts. Others were machined in rear area depots under vague orders. The design was never standardized because it couldn't be. It had to respond to the field, to temperature, to supply, to terrain. It was a solution that thrived because it was imperfect, adaptable, rough-edged, and born not in an institute but in the dirt under a dying tank. The last time Gurevich crawled under a machine in uniform was in January 1945. A newer T-34-85 had stalled just outside of Kielce. The engine was fine, the turret was intact, but a factory-fitted improved cooling system had seized the fan rotor. The crew was preparing to abandon it. Gurevich pulled open the casing, spit into the intake valve and watched the steam rise. "They've gone back to the blueprint," he muttered. Didn't learn a thing. He bypassed the regulator, rerouted the fan wire to the headlight circuit, the same trick he had used nearly 2 years earlier. It worked again. "They'll probably call this new too," he said. After the war, Gurevich returned to Kharkov. He declined a post at the Central Engineering Bureau. Instead, he taught mechanical systems to apprentices in a rail depot, where diesel engines still hissed under tin roofs and where steam was an old friend. No one spoke of the Mk7. No one awarded him anything. In the 1960s, he was interviewed briefly by a local veterans paper. When asked what he remembered most about the war, he didn't speak of battle or bravery. He said, "Machines break, always. That's not failure. That's design talking to you. If you listen close enough, they'll tell you what they need." The quote ran beneath a grainy photo of a man whose eyes looked past the camera, as though watching steam rise off steel again. Yosif Gurevich died in 1971. No ceremony. Buried under a small plaque outside Kharkov with the simple inscription mechanic, teacher, engineer. But every so often, in tank restoration circles, a peculiar field modification shows up in archival blueprints, an odd copper vent, hand-threaded, just off pattern. They call it the Gurevich bypass. No one knows who named it that. But it stuck, because somewhere out in the sun-scorched fields of Ukraine, in the shadow of war and steel, a mechanic built something that kept moving when everything else burned.